Very nice schedule, but I'm try and go as quickly as I can. Can we all gather around? And I'll make a start. I know you want to go for lunch at 12 noon, maybe 10 past.
I actually signed up from front. I sent in my name to second up from front. I did that. I never actually trying to test or done.
Okay, I'll make a start. The first lecture was about why DNA. The second lecture is going to be about autosomal DNA, which is all your other chromosomes apart from the Y chromosome. And I'm going to talk about how it can be used to solve adoption mysteries. And adoption mysteries are very, very relevant to everybody in the room, partly because, yes, we all probably have an adoption somewhere in our family, but more so because when you go back to that brick wall ancestor, your great-great-great-grandfather, who is his father? You don't know. Who is his mother? You don't know. It's exactly the same situation with adoptees. And so the techniques that we've developed for helping adoptees break through their brick wall can be applied to our genealogies as well. Because for all intents and purposes, our brick wall ancestor is actually behaving like an adoptee. We don't know the father, we don't know the mother. And we've seen this slide before. Here is the nucleus, here are the mitochondrial DNA. There's the sex chromosomes there, XX and XY, and these are useful because the mitochondrial DNA will give us certain clues. The Y DNA will give us certain clues on the father-father-father line. The X DNA is only inherited along certain ancestral lines. There are only certain ancestors that can have given you your X DNA, okay? And that's going to be very, very useful when we look at one of the examples. So, for example, all the men in the audience, they'll got a Y DNA from their father, they'll have an X DNA from their mother. So if somebody matches you on your X DNA and you're a man, you know it has to come from your mother's side of the family. It cannot come from your father's side of the family, and that narrows down the candidates for the common ancestor to only 50% of your ancestors, those on your mother's side of the family. So we'll look a little bit about that. Just to recap, Y DNA, father, 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 one ancestral line. Mitochondrial DNA, mother, 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 one ancestral line. Autosomal DNA, all of the ancestral lines, going back to about your 5th, 6th, 7th generations. That's about 64 great-great-great-grandparents. So the useful thing about Y DNA is that if you're an adoptee, it can identify the surname of your birth father. And we'll take a look at that. The mitochondrial DNA is not much use for adoption cases, but it can give you some clues. There's 3 main companies that do DNA: Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, Family Tree DNA. Most of the tests are around about $99 in the States. In Ireland, Family Tree DNA is $99. 23andMe is approximately $169, I believe it is, and £169. And Ancestry DNA is, I think, £125. So they're a bit more expensive over here than they are in the States. This is an old slide that shows you the size of the databases, but now, like I said earlier, there are around about 1 million people in each database. And if you're an adoptee, what we recommend that you do is you test with all 3 of the companies. And you do the autosomal DNA test, which looks at all of your ancestors. There's also GEDmatch, which is very, very useful. Whatever company you test with, this is a free website where you can upload your data for free, and it's a public platform, and anybody from any of the companies can upload their data for free, and it allows you to compare your family tree DNA data with somebody else's ancestry DNA data, or somebody else's 23andMe data. So it can be very, very useful, and it's a free website. So that's something to consider as well. People will recognize Philomena Lee, played in the movie by Judi Dench with Steve Coogan, fabulous movie. And Philomena's story is probably very familiar to you. She was a lady who was forced to give up her child for adoption when she was a young teenage girl, a fallen woman, as they used to call them back then. And she spent her life looking for her child. And if you haven't seen the movie, definitely go and see it. But for somebody like Philomena, if she was to do her DNA testing, and she was to test with all three companies, give the DNA sample to Family Tree DNA, 23andMe, and Ancestry DNA, the results would come about 4 to 10 weeks later. If her child had already tested and was in the database, she would get a match to that child, and she would actually find that child just like that. So it's a long shot, of course, but for those people who gave up children 50 years ago, those children, if they were adopted, say, to the US, might be very interested in researching their family tree, finding out their ethnic makeup. They may have done the test, and if those women who gave their children up do this DNA test, they might actually find their child in the database 50 years later. Or a grandchild, then there's a 25% match on the DNA, or they might find other relatives, which they might not be particularly interested in, first cousins, second cousins, third cousins, But, if you are somebody who's given up a child 50 years ago, then certainly having your DNA tested in all three companies, and even if you don't find your child, if at some stage in the future your child or their grandchildren go looking for their genetic roots, at least you've left a genetic legacy for them to find.
Could I interrupt you one moment?
Sure.
Would the child be informed if the mother had done
Yeah.
research and they were,
Well,
would they know simultaneously?
It depends very much on whether you privatize your results or not. You see, you might privatize it, you might give a false name, like John Doe or 12345, and you might create a special email address, 12345@gmail.com, where there's no clue to the identity of the person behind the email or the identity of the person behind the name that's attached to that particular kit. But what will happen in this particular situation, the mother tests, and if the child's already in the database, the child will get a notification, you have a close relative match. Go to your web page and look it up. And they will see 50% match, oh my God, that's either one of my parents, but it has to be one of my parents. So it will be a kind of an instant thing. And that's why before you do this type of testing, you have to have a very good idea in your own head, what are you going to say to the person when they find you? So have your letters written, put your thoughts down on paper and be prepared to actually make contact with the person for the first time in decades. And, try and make the reconnection as as smooth as possible, because this brings up so many emotions you'll see later on. If, however, you are an adoptee, and this could be an informal adoption, a secret adoption, an illegal adoption, and a lot of this happened in Ireland even after the law was passed in 1952, there won't be any adoption documentation. There won't be any non-identifying information. And in that situation, there's no clues, and DNA is probably your only hope to identify your birth family and connect with maybe your parents, your birth parents, or half-siblings, as is often the case. So, looking at Y DNA first, and this only applies to men. Women don't have a Y chromosome, men have the Y chromosome. But if you're a man and you've been adopted, you do your Y DNA test, it can identify the surname of your birth father roughly in about 10 to 15% of cases. Okay? Looking at some data from 163 people who tested in London at Who Do You Think You Are, I looked through all of the results, and in about 10% of cases, the matches that the people got were indicative of their surname. Okay? And here's an example. These would be the results of, say, a Finbar O'Brien, a fictitious name. But so he's an adoptee, and he does his Y-DNA test, and he finds that at 12 markers, he's got a match called Massey, Simmons, Massey, Simmons. So even at 12 marker level, which is a very, very low level of resolution, he has two clear signals for what his surname could be. It could be Simmons or it could be Massey. If he goes up to 25 markers, then he's got Massey, Massey, Simmons, 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 Massey, and no. And if he goes up to 37 markers, he's got Massey, Simmons, and Simmons. So it's still, those two names are still within his matches. So this gives him a very, very good lead. He should be looking for people called Simmons, or he should be looking for people called Massey. And that's the most likely candidate for the surname of his biological father. So Y-DNA can be very, very useful in about 10 to 15% of cases. When you look at autosomal DNA, it gives you a variety of different things, such as your ethnic makeup, and then connecting you with genetic cousins. It also gives you a medical risk assessment if you test with 23andMe. It also gives you what percentage Neanderthal DNA you have, although a lot of women in the audience would argue that I don't need to, when I look at my husband, I don't need DNA to tell me what kind of Neanderthal percentage he is. And like I say, GetMatch is very, very useful as well for uploading your results from whichever company you test with, and that way you're fishing in 3 pools instead of 1 pool. And here's an adoptee. She does the DNA sample with all 3 companies. The results come back 4 to 10 weeks later. If her parent is in the database, she'll be a 50% match. If she has a half sibling in the database, she'll have a 25% match. And if she has some other genetic relative in the database, such as a half nephew, 12.5%, first cousin, 12.5%, second cousin, 3%, third, fourth, fifth, and so on and so on and so on. So you can tell by looking at the percentage of DNA shared roughly where that connection is. Is it second cousin, third cousin, fourth cousin? And have your letters ready. Have your support network alerted. You shouldn't be doing this on your own. You should have your friends around you. Maybe that's a good time to get counselling if you've never thought about doing it before, because emotions will definitely come up. If your parent was adopted or your grandparent was adopted, you still follow the same kind of technique, sending the DNA sample of your, you send your own DNA sample in if your parent wasn't alive or your grandparent wasn't alive to give the sample. And again, the same kind of technique. If a grandparent is in the database, 25%, that would be very rare. But if you had maybe a half aunt or uncle in the database, that would show up. If you had some other relative, like a half first cousin or a second cousin, third, fourth, they would show up as well. This is how you would approach testing if your parent or your grandparent was adopted as well. And again, have your letters ready. You probably don't know me, but I'm probably descended from the illegitimate child that nobody in your family ever knew about. Bit of a shock. This is what your autosomal DNA results will look like. So, for example, up here we have a list of your matches. There's me up there. I think these are my father's results. Thankfully, I'm a very, very strong match with my dad. That was a relief. And it shows you the name, the date that the match was made, the estimated relationship, and you can change that to the actual relationship by entering that in manually. And it shows you the amount of DNA that's shared. And there's a large blue line compared to these smaller blue lines down here, where there's much less DNA shared. And it gives you the actual amount there, the total amount of DNA expressed in centimorgans. Think of it like centimeters. It's just a measure of quantity, a measure of the amount of DNA that you have. And I share 3,000 centimorgans with my dad, which is what you'd expect of a parent-child relationship. Grandparent, 668. So it's only a quarter. And then first to second cousin, 66%, second to fourth, 45%, third to fifth, 56 centimorgan, and so on. And it goes down the further you go away. If you click on the name of your match, you get your match's email address and some information about your match, the most distant known ancestors. On my father's side is John Gleason. On my mother's side is Catherine Farrell. And then I've put in my ancestral surnames of all the surnames in my family. So this is the kind of results that you'll get when you do this type of autosomal DNA test. Also, by clicking on the email icon, it comes up with the person's email address and you can actually send them an email. So it's very rare that you'll actually find a parent or a grandparent or a sibling in the database. You're much more likely to find a first to second cousin or second to fourth, third to fifth cousin. You're going to have thousands of fifth cousins, hundreds of fourth cousins, tens of third cousins, couple of second cousins, first cousins. It gets more as you get further out. Just because of mathematics, it multiplies that way. I use a step-by-step approach to your autosomal DNA matches. So you get a list of matches, and me and my dad, we have about 600 matches each. And really, you're just interested in the top 10% because they are going to be the closest ones. And I follow this step-by-step approach. The first step is, where does the common ancestor sit in the family tree, based on the amount of DNA that they share? Second step, is the common ancestor obvious? Third step, eliminate non-contenders. And the fourth step is to work with small triangulated groups. And I'll explain what that term means in due course. But it uses a mixture of genealogy, DNA, and collaboration with other people. Now, the good news is you can forget about the DNA side of things completely if you want to. Because all the DNA is saying at the end of the day is you and you're related. You match each other in your DNA. Now go away and look at your family trees and figure out where you're connected. You're looking for common locations, common surnames, and common individuals. Is the John Gleason in your tree the same as the John Gleason in my tree? Let's do some documentary evidence digging and try and sort it out. So, step one, where does the common ancestor sit? And this purely relies on genealogy. It's positioning the common ancestor on your family tree. So, for example, if I have a match who is a third cousin, I know that the common ancestor is going to be a great-great-grandfather. So I'll go back father, grandfather, great-great-great. That puts me around about 1835. Okay? So it's just about positioning the person on your tree. And I've got 16 great-great-grandparents in 8 couples. So I've got 8 couples of great-great-grandparents. So I've narrowed down the search to those 8 couples initially. If I've got 5th cousins, then I've got, they go back up there, and I have 32 couples that I have to think about. And that is a degree of complexity that's a little bit more difficult to handle. And of course, a 5th cousin estimate, confidence intervals on either side, it could be a 6th or a 7th or an 8th cousin, or it could be a 4th cousin. So you do have to consider the other generation levels as well. The second step is the common ancestor obvious? And you can only do this by comparing trees. And the best thing to do, I think, is to share the link to your online tree. So that raises the question, is your tree up to date? Is it as far back as it could possibly be? Are you happy to share your tree with somebody else? Are you happy to put your tree online? You know, these are all questions that you need to decide